What about technology in this universal world? You know, by 2020 we will have mobile devices faster than a 2005 PC. And all innovation is divergent. This comes back to the issue about the radar screen. Let me say again, you cannot innovate through benchmarking. Benchmarking is a way to oblivion. All you do is become identical to everyone else on price and quality. So how do you have a competitive advantage? Every competitive advantage happens not from convergence, but from divergence. It happens from the outer edge of the radar screen where no one else is looking. And yes, I know we can think about some crazy ways that technology might innovate for the future, and some of them might seem laughable to you, but we will find new ways to use just about anything. Okay. Oh, what about the brain and IT? I'm interested in bio-digital worlds. We have not only the capacity, I think, in the future to produce a camera with the resolution of the human eye. By the way, it could be a bio camera. One of the things, we already have the capacity to regrow retinal cells at the back of the eye of someone who's gone blind. And these cells automatically connect to the optic nerve so an animal can see again. Astonishing. Now I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about the fusion of digital and bio worlds. I'm talking about these brain cells, which you can see here, growing on the surface of a computer chip. Brain cells are intelligent, and they recognize other intelligence. And brain cells automatically connect to computer chips. They need no teaching, they just do it. All you do is you mix brain cells in water, you float them onto the surface of chips, you sit back and relax and feed them. And if you do that, you will find quite soon that electrical signals start to be picked up by the chips. The brain cells connect not only to the chips, but they also start to put out feelers to each other. They connect to each other, they connect to the chip. You get a bio-digital device. I'm telling you history, my friends. You tell me the future. These devices have been grown for the last 5 to 10 years. So, could we have a human brain that can go online? This is history. We already did it in animals. We have rats and mice that can think electrically. They produce currents and thoughts which go from one mouse to another. The mouse says, "I'm thirsty," and a signal electronically goes to another mouse in another laboratory saying, "Please, can you give me a drink?" If the other mouse agrees to give the first mouse a drink, he gets some food. We are living in a strange world. I am not saying that you're going to have a plug-in module for mathematics in the future or language. I'm just saying we are entering new territory for the future. So, what about other ways of thinking about innovation?
We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. Expect us.
Leave your purse and wallet at home.
That's right. Soon you'll be shopping with biometric technology, where your fingerprint helps you pay. A Central Texas company is behind the high-tech concept. However, with this convenience comes a question about privacy.
Several Central Texas grocery and retail stores offer a new way to buy and bag. The Kroger's grocery stores in Bryan and College Station are piloting a project that uses fingerprints that link to your credit, debit card, or checking account. You choose how it's set up.
Now, Annie, please type your telephone number.
Your telephone number acts as a password, so does your driver's license. But your fingerprint double checks that password. Identity theft is a growing crime nationwide. In this case, a little more security requires a little invasion of your privacy. And so far, many customers are willing to trade that for a little extra convenience.
And now Troy with his finger on the weather.
Right. Reject. That would go.
Yeah, luckily it's not, we're not linked into the police department.
No, not yet at this point. Don't tell them the secret.
Hey, please, the committee, my name is Will Delker. I am a Senior Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Justice Bureau of the Attorney General's Office.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Morning, Councilor. Is it fair to say that if Real ID Act of 2005 hadn't been passed, the AG's office would still be here because of all the changes in telecommunications making this request?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think our original proposal, what I looked at online today was that the original bill did not include the real ID component of it. I think that that was the amendment that was added in the Senate. And our office doesn't take any position on the real ID component of it. This bill was proposed simply to address that technical change in the law. And real ID, I mean, we're not taking a position. I'm not here to testify about that. I frankly don't know.
For the record, my name is Joel Lynchers. I represent Hillsborough District 17, which is Manchester's wards 10, 11, and 12. I know we've already had a couple hours of testimony on this bill, so I'll try and be brief. I think you all know that I oppose the Real ID Act and that I oppose asking for an extension for compliance with the Real ID Act. And when I heard that the Senate had attached an amendment to a bill that requested the governor ask for this extension, I asked myself, why wouldn't that be a non-germane amendment? What kind of bill could possibly be related to the Real ID Act, which pushes a national ID card, maybe moves America a little closer to a police state, demolishes privacy and civil liberties for Americans? What kind of bill could possibly be related to that? So then I read Senate Bill 434. I'm firmly opposed to Senate Bill 434, with or without the amendment asking for an extension of Real ID. In order for this information to be turned over, there have to be records kept. And we've seen too many people have their credit cards numbers stolen from TJ Maxx, from Hanford's, other places, because people were careless in storing our constituents' personal information. And what this legislation does is require even more records to be kept, even more of our constituents' personal information be kept and recorded and be accessible. And I think there's a danger to that. But overall, this legislation, it chips away at the privacy, the civil liberties, and the values that are so important to so many people here in New Hampshire. And I would hope that the community can find this inexpedient to legislate. Thank you.
For the record, my name is Howard Wilson. I come here in generalized opposition to the whole of this legislation. And sadly, between Tuesday's hearing and today's hearing, it's been extremely educational. It hasn't done a lot for me, but it's been educational nonetheless.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Claire Ewell. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Civil Liberties Union, and I am unalterably opposed to any participation in the Real ID Act of 2005. I am not for a moment suggesting that General Delper or General Ayotte or any of those people in the AG's office are untrustworthy. But it is your job as legislators to be prepared for the Assistant Attorney General at some time in the future who may not be. And that is why, as legislators, you put constraints around the unfettered ability of the executive branch to act without judicial oversight. I don't mean to babble, Madam Chair, but this is such an important issue in terms of balancing privacy with the genuine needs of the Attorney General's office to pursue crime that all of us want pursued and all of us want the criminals caught. But if we sacrifice our privacy in the course of that conduct, we are left with a society that we won't recognize when we hand it over to our children and grandchildren. With regard to the second part of the bill, Madam Chair, you are being asked to violate New Hampshire law if you pass Section 2 of the bill. In 2007, when you almost unanimously passed the Real ID law, and the Senate did pass it unanimously, it was incorporated into Section 263 of the RSAs, which deal with driver's licenses. And I would just like to quote to you one section. The state of New Hampshire shall not participate in any driver's license program. It shall not amend its procedures or comply with any rules or regulations promulgated under the Real ID Act of 2005. The exception which you seek, the waiver which you ask for, which is asked for in this bill, is in compliance with the rules and regulations of the Real ID Act of 2005, and therefore would be in violation of the act that you adopted in 2007.
Representative Hopper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Ms. Evil. It's bothering me because I find myself in agreement with you again, and it's
I'm going to ruin your
I had a couple questions. One, as far as the Real ID portion of this, if a citizen in New Hampshire still, they keep pushing back the dates, I don't know where we're at now, but wants to comply, i.e. they have business and they want to keep taking planes, they can currently get a passport which does comply with Real ID and would be unnecessary for New Hampshire to comply with it. Is that correct?
Representative Hopper, I think it's far more complicated than that. First of all, there is no state in the Union that has a Real ID compliant license. And no state in the Union is required to provide a Real ID compliant license to any of its citizens until 2014. And for those of us who were born after 1960, I think.
64, I thought it was.
Is it 64?
I think so.
That they will not have to comply until 2017. And so it is a pretext, from my perspective, that Homeland Security and Mr. Chertoff are engaged in right now to say New Hampshire citizens will not be allowed to board planes based on their New Hampshire driver's license because it's not Real ID compliant, because no driver's license is and doesn't have to be for another 6 years or 9 years. And so what I think you're in now is what is called a contest, and I won't use the impolite word that usually precedes it. Because I think the Homeland Security chief is unhappy with those of us who live in states that said, frankly, hell no, we won't go to the federal government. There are now 7 states that have statutorily refused to comply, and 11 states that have refused to comply by legislative, words gone. That's happening to me a lot. Resolution, thank you, Representative Chase, what a savior. And so, in addition, you can fly now, and always could, without any identification at all. You simply have to submit to a secondary search. And so with our theoretically non-compliant New Hampshire licenses, we can still fly with them, but you submit to a lawn search. The reality of the passport is that it is an expensive device for individuals to skirt what I believe to be an unconstitutional requirement by Homeland Security to say you must have a driver compliant license by May the 11th, but you don't have to produce one until 2011 or 2014 or 2017. There's a lawsuit there, I'm certain, to suggest that how are we going to produce a compliant license if no one has one until 2014? The whole thing sounds to me like what my Irish grandmother used to call a tempest in a teapot.
So, follow up, please. So, but for the people, because the problem with this is I agree with a lot of people, I'm sure in the audience, that we should never comply with Real ID. But the reality is, if all of a sudden you went to the airport and citizens of New Hampshire could not board a plane to go do business in New York, they'd all be calling me on the phone and saying, what are you, a jerk, and all this other stuff. They call me that anyway. But my question is, under the system, regardless of when it takes place or doesn't take place, an individual in New Hampshire who wants to do business in New York and take a plane, regardless of when anything goes into effect, could use a passport and skirt ignore whatever New Hampshire does do. Is that correct?
Representative Papa, that is correct, they can do so now. You don't
Right.
need a state ID, you can use your passport as ID. But as I said, they can still go to New York to do business
Right, I
with a New
understand.
Hampshire driver's license if they submit to a secondary search.
My name is Bob Constantine, and I've lived in New Hampshire almost 50 years. I don't support warrantless searches addressing the first part of the bill, nor does our state or our U.S. Constitution. I won't read them, but I would ask you to maybe jot down in the New Hampshire Constitution Articles 37 and 38, which address that. In the United States Constitution, Article 4. And I'll end on the first part. I'll simply say I think those who support the first part of Bill 434, regardless of their expertise, they really don't comprehend the true intent of those articles. On the second part, concerning Real ID, I want to express my real concern over Real ID in any attempt by the state of New Hampshire to request an extension to comply with the federal government's Real ID policies. We resoundingly rejected this opportunity and enacted a law stating we would not participate. In the body of the law, we found Real ID to be repugnant. That was a proud moment for me. Somebody asked, what should I do, if I get phone calls and all that. I mean, I'll tell you what I think. I think that this is a political game and it's a political move, and I think it's bad. You all took an oath to uphold the Constitution, not to subvert it, not to circumvent it, or not to reinterpret it, but to uphold it. And there's nobody here who didn't take that oath. So most of the answers that you see, they're already laid out. I'll close with 3 very good reasons to reject Real ID and any request for an extension. I think it's an illegal and unfounded mandate. It's also an expensive, inefficient bureaucracy that must be funded. Thomas Jefferson said, "I am for a government rigorously frugal and simple. Were we directed from Washington when to sow, when to reap, we should soon want bread." The second reason, I think it's a blatant attempt to false flag and arouse phony patriotism when it really tears at the very heart of liberty. James Madison said, "Perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to the provision against danger, real or pretended, from abroad." And the last reason, the issue in New Hampshire, as has been stated, has already been decided. We've already said no thanks. We have a law that says we will not participate. So I believe it's a done deal and the case is closed. So finally, I think if anyone wants to go further with Real ID, we need to call on the governor, our U.S. senators, our congressmen, and our state senators to ask and remind the federal government that not only does New Hampshire reject Real ID, but we believe the whole plan for all the states is illegal and repugnant, and to tell them they're past their enumerated powers in enacting the plan in the first place. Thank you for listening and for having the courage to uphold the oath that you all took.
Dennis Goddard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. I really appreciate your coming out on an off day and listening to all these people. I'll be respectful as possible of your time, and I'll be very brief. I would just like to discuss 3 points. I'd like to discuss a little bit of technical detail concerning what Mr. Delker told you. I'd like to talk a little bit about the point raised by Mr. Collins concerning some technical issues. And lastly, I'd like to share with you a little bit of my technical expertise concerning the bill as a whole. So first, I think we all understand that Claire made it very clear that there's a difference between an emergency situation requiring immediate attention and an ongoing investigation. What I would like to point out is that absent the bomb scare and the immediate "I'm going to kill you" problem, if you're doing an ongoing investigation into, say, a drug deal or a stalker, the only kinds of people that this legislation, if passed, completely as written, the only kind of people that you can protect against are the smallest fish in the pond. I'd like to help you with your crime-fighting careers. I know you don't get paid enough for this job. If you want to commit a crime and you have a phone, you go and buy a track phone at Walmart with cash. I don't care who subpoenas what, you're not going to find any information about me, period, in the story. Okay? If we want to say that cash is going to be illegal, let that be a separate issue. On a similar point, you talked a little bit about dynamic IP addresses and driving by a Dunkin' Donuts. I'm sure most of you are aware, especially if you live in a larger city, there are things called open Wi-Fi access points. Just open up your laptop, click on wireless connections, and you'll see probably at least one or two with names that are the default issued by the manufacturer, like Belkin or Linksys or Netgear, that you can just go ahead and connect to. The person who owns that Wi-Fi little router box has no idea you're connected. Their ISP is giving you an IP address. They have no idea who you are and no way of tracking who you are. This gets into Representative Harvey's question about my brother-in-law. It's not only the fact that you can't choose your family, you even less can choose your in-laws, but you really can't choose who happens to be within about a 100-yard radius of your house and might be using your internet connection. Unless you're particularly technically savvy, you probably don't know how to close up your wireless Wi-Fi and then not have to protect yourself and prove your innocence against someone who may be committing a crime. One other point with respect to Mr. Delker's testimony, I would refer you to Part 1, Article 8 of the New Hampshire Constitution. I think we all have this weird, vague sense that there's something wrong with getting complete immunity to someone who might be giving up our records. And I would just point out that all power residing originally in and being derived from the people, and all magistrates and officers of government are their substitutes and agents, and at all times accountable to them. I would propose to you that if we pass legislation that requires internet service providers to hand over my information, those people in effect become the substitute and agent of the government. And the Constitution requires that they be accountable. But that's not the real meat of this issue. The real meat, if we cut through all the technical baloney, what we have here is an extremely large corporation in conjunction with the executive branch of government lobbying you to cede up some of the people's liberty. Part 1, Article 3 makes it very, very clear in the New Hampshire Constitution that the reason that we have a government is that we give up some of our liberties in order to get back some protection. It also makes it clear that where that protection is not given, the contract is null and void. So you've heard from the executive that they'd like some of our liberty. You've heard from a large corporation that they'd be easy fine for them to give up some of our liberty. But I will pose to you that what you're going to hear from every other person who comes and sits here before you, who is in fact one of the people or their elected representative, they're asking you to please preserve our liberty. This is what you are hearing overwhelmingly. I don't believe there's a single person that's going to come to you and say, I want you to make me a little safer. I want you to give me more protection and give up some of that liberty. You're not going to hear that. I'll just go on with it to make that prediction. My second point, which will be briefer. We heard from Senator Janeway and we heard from Mr. Collins that Comcast Corporation is absolutely fine and dandy and can handle whatever requirements are laid out in this bill. Well, of course. Those of you who are big fans of Milton Friedman, as I am, even if you're not a big fan and haven't read his scholarly stuff, if you read Free to Choose, which he co-authored with his wife Rose, fantastic book, describes this process that happens over and over and over again. There is a public problem. There is a danger you're being asked to solve the problem because your legislators are not technical experts in general. You go to industry to find out how best they should be regulated. Industry tells you how they should be regulated, and what that does is entrenches the ability of the large organizations, the large corporations currently in business, probably not intentionally. They know how to police themselves and they can, but it makes it extremely difficult for small, agile companies that are just starting out to be able to provide products and services that customers might want. Let me give you an example. Comcast is pointing out that this voice over IP thing is new. It's not new. Man, that is so 2 years ago. Okay? For people in the IT industry, if you don't have voice over IP now, I mean, you're wearing the wrong kind of suit, baby. Things like IP television on mobile handsets are a little bit hot now, although that's so old that even I've heard of it. Okay, and I'm not getting hip anymore. Comcast doesn't provide IP television services. Personally, by the way, I do subscribe to Comcast. I'm not saying they're evil. They give me a really good rate. But Comcast is not in the business of providing mobile MP3s, mobile television access, mobile geolocation services, all kinds of other things that we might like to do. Those are really being staked out by small companies in places like Silicon Valley. I have friends involved in some of these startup companies. You know, they're not paying me to be here. Although it'd be nice if they did. These kind of companies aren't in a position to be able to go through the extra work it would be required to comply with this kind of legislation. They're not here because they don't even know what's going on because they don't have a legal team keeping track of these things. So the fact that Comcast is here telling you that this is fine and dandy doesn't mean that the industry is here telling you that this is fine and dandy. What that means is the small guys, the startups, are probably going to be hurt. Lastly, something that touches both aspects, the first and second parts of the bill. As it turns out, in my professional life, I have a perspective on this legislation that is probably quite unique to individuals in Concord, maybe even individuals in my state. I am a senior development manager at the largest database corporation in the world. I guarantee there is information in a database manufactured by my company on every single person in the room. Okay? Now, I have two pieces of information to tell you about large databases that any software engineer is going to be able to corroborate for you. Point number one, all software has bugs. I have a team of people that work in different time zones around the world so that they can fix bugs 24/7, 365. It's really cool. We have people in India who are not Christian that can work on Christmas. We have, people in other places that are Hindu that work on Diwali, and it all works out great. They fix bugs all day, every day. Bugs in databases, bugs that cause corruption, bugs that cause people to be able to snatch things out of the database without you knowing it. That's just the deal. That's part of software. Number two, human beings occasionally make mistakes. And they will with the data that is recorded in these databases. So for all of the reasons listed above, I ask you not to amend this bill to make it better, not to maybe shore up some of our liberties. None of the people who are here before you or their elected representatives who are before you are really asking you, please shore up this piece and put a little extra lock on it. You're being asked overwhelmingly to ITL this legislation. That is what the people are asking you for. Thank you. Again, I don't presume to speak for all the citizens of New Hampshire, but what I've heard from other people sitting in this chair is that this should be ITL, and it would be great for some new piece of legislation whose clear intended purpose is rolling back some of the powers that the AG currently enjoys.
Thank you.
Please, if there was one thing that I would ask of my government, please stop protecting me.
Anyone else wish to speak? At this time, I will close the public hearing on Senate Bill 434.
And the last one I want to touch on before I go back to that book review is, again, from the anti-media, and this is what they called it: a national ID card is coming soon, and you will need it to fly and drive. The U.S. federal government is preparing to implement a national ID card despite the fact that several states continue to resist the controversial program. Now, I call it a national ID card, and some people may have issue with that because they think it's fear-mongering or whatever, but, I mean, come on, look at the evidence and look at what they're doing here. Is basically the federal government has a program, and there are states, there's still 5 states in one territory resisting this. There's other states dragging their feet and saying, like, all right, we're going to get in line with the conditions, but we're going to take our time. And the federal government is saying, in order to stop terrorism and counterfeiting, et cetera, fear, we have to update our the standards of the ID, and we need to get all of our states in line with federal mandates and federal standards. We're not all going to have the exact same card. You'll still have your state license, but they're all going to have the same basic protocol. So this is one step towards uniformity, towards centralization of identification cards around the country. And not only that, the federal government is using it to coerce people and to coerce the states into getting it, because they're using their federal agency, the Department of Homeland Security and the Transportation Security Administration, which are basically just commandeering state airports and just hanging out in there. And they're telling their federal agents, do not allow anybody to fly after this certain date unless they have the proper identification, which goes along with what we passed as the federal government. So think about that. Even if your senator or your congressman or whatever voted against the Real ID in 2005 and again in 2007, because this thing was heavily debated from 2005 and it's been updated several times. And which is why there's so much conflicting information, which, I just want to get clear to you guys. I know people have said before, the national ID card's coming beginning this date, something. Well, it's been updated again, and it really is coming. And I just don't understand how people don't recognize it as an attempt to create a national ID card, because, like I said, the federal government is using the force that they wield to push the states into an area they may not want to go. So it's essentially coming down to a situation where people who want to fly and need to fly, such as myself, for work or whatever it may be, or just for travel and for vacation, you're now going to have to look to the federal government for help, because it's like, oh, wow, my state's not getting in line with the Real ID. Now I can't fly. Great. Way to go, Texas. But to me, I'm hoping that Texas and more states will stand out and fight against the federal government and say, you know what? We don't approve of this. We're not going to do it, but we're still going to fly, and really create a battle between the states and the federal government. That's what I hope that we need. All right, that's what I believe we need is we need more opposition. We need more direct challenging of their power and non-compliance. But beginning January 22nd, 2018, all airline passengers will need identification cards that are in compliance with the more secure features required by the Real ID Act of 2005. Of course, this act was passed in response to the 9/11 attacks as part of the global war on terror. Until this deadline, all states' driver's licenses and passports will be valid for airline travel, so you can still fly. Currently, 5 states and 1 territory, Illinois, Minnesota, Missouri, New Mexico, Washington, and American Samoa, do not comply with the Real ID standards and are not trying to. But there are more states that don't comply. Several other states are reportedly taking steps to update their ID cards. And this would include Texas. And I give you I give you the link to the list of these states so you can look it up yourself. And just to be certain, travelers in states that do not comply with the stricter security measures will be forced to use an alternative form of identification. And, when you really start to break this down, though, you have to recognize that you're not even going to be able to drive. If they're saying they want to replace ID cards and driver's licenses with the Real ID standards, and your state isn't in compliance with those standards, then legally you wouldn't be driving with a legal ID card. And that would not only restrict your right to fly, but to drive eventually, is what I'm thinking. When announcing the new guidelines, Jay Johnson, Secretary of Homeland Security, offered a firm call to states that would dare challenge the federal government's plans. I actually think it was a thinly veiled threat. Over the next 2 years, those states that are not Real ID compliant are strongly encouraged to meet the requirements of the law for the benefits of their residents, he told USA Today. Strongly encouraged to meet the requirements. He's basically saying, states, if you want your people to be able to fly, get in line now, because we're not playing these games anymore. There are currently 23 states that are already complying with the Real ID. 27 states and territories have been granted extensions to comply with the rule changes. And as I said, you can see this link to see what your state's doing right now. And I give a brief history of my experience flying without an ID, because yes, you can fly without an ID. The TSA admits this on their website, but you're going to have to deal with extra harassment. I mean, that's really it's up to you to decide, because whenever I used to fly without ID, they pull you aside, they make you talk to the Department of Homeland Security, they ask you what elementary you went to, really invasive questions. And I asked the dude who was on the phone, who are you talking to? He's like, I'm talking to someone from the Department of Homeland Security. So once I answered all those questions, I was free to fly. But still, you have to decide, each of us really as free individuals have to decide, are you willing to deal with that extra harassment in order to fly? Or is it worth it to you to get this real ID? And for me personally, I want to resist these things. Like I said, I want non-compliance. I want to push back. I want to show them that I'm not going to play their game. And if that means a little bit extra hassle for me, that's fine. But I'm still going to take the steps I can to make myself a more free person and as quote, quote, off the grid as possible. I'm getting my new ID before Texas complies. Then I'm getting my passport, and that's all I'm going to use is my passport. I'm going to get rid of my state ID and all that stuff. I want to be able to leave this country when and if necessary. And I do think at some point they may start restricting travel outside of the country or even interstate travel. So it's important to be ready to go at a moment's notice. And that's not to spread any fear. This is just all awareness. Look into this article, see what you think about it, and let's talk more about that later.